Hello, I'm Antoinette James. Welcome to Behind the Beehive, where I look behind the political show and try and reveal the truth. Today we're going to look at uh, our right to food. Our right. We've been given the right to food. Glory be. Let's just unpack what that actually means. What's the significance of that? I had a checked out some of the law dictionaries just to find out what right means. And as you can imagine, with law dictionaries, it goes on and on and on because there's so many different rights. There's civil rights and constitutional rights, and it goes on and on and on. So it's really very hard to pin down what that actually meant. In the law dictionary, very hard to pin it down. You would need a lawyer to even work through that. And once you actually got down what the meaning of right means in the context of food, I think it would probably go up to a lot of discussion amongst lawyers. It's very complex. You know, we've got the law dictionary, quite different than our common dictionary. The common dictionary is for us plebs, the law dictionary are for the legalese, all that language. So it became very, very complicated to really work out what that all meant. So I thought, well, it's the United Nations, bless them, that have given us the right to food, as if, you know, we've never had that in our lives. And it's the Food and Agriculture Organization that kind of was the next place to put a little look at. And a name came up, Oliver de Schutter, and he is a guy that oversaw or was the United Nations rapporteur between 2008 and 2014. And a rapporteur is someone that's chosen by an organization, and their job is to prepare all the reports and do all the investigation. They're just the big wig and making sure that the narrative is correct and everyone's on board with the rules of the game, as it were. Now, it didn't surprise me that he was a Belgian, because I'm sorry to say it, but many of the evils of this world come out of the governance of Belgium. Belgium was the only country in Europe, or in the world really, that allowed the Jesuits to stay during the 1800s, when over 80 countries banished the Jesuits from their shores. So evil they were. Even Japan, and so frightful of the Jesuits were the Japanese people that they wouldn't allow any European to step foot in their nation for over 100 years. The Jesuits, we know, also ran the Paraguay reductions, a horrendous socialist or sort of reservation, I suppose, that all looked good, very much like the United Nations. It looks fabulous. All the lovely words are all there, and everyone's fed, and there's entertainment, it's such freedoms. But the reality is that they were very oppressed people, and they were banished from South America as well. Such was the tyranny that they caused there amongst the native Indians. So it didn't surprise me that this guy was there and from Belgium, and the seat of the Holy Roman Empire, going way back. So once you get into that, you realize that the Food and Agriculture Organization have a little motto, and that motto is Fiat Panis. So what does that mean? Well, it means let there be bread. Now, where have we heard that before? Maybe a little bit different, and it's been assigned to Marie Antoinette, the French princess or French queen or consort, uh, there's no real link to say that she did say that, but we know that as the flyaway, dismissive comment made by the elite of the time, when the people couldn't even get bread. They were starving, and she was supposed to have said, let them eat cake. So when I heard that the Food and Agriculture Organization have this, it caught my attention, because the one thing we know with the elite is they are very careful how they choose their words. They're very prescribed, and it all has double meanings. One for us, the plebs, the goyim, the cattle, the useless eaters, and one for them, and their black humor. So, we might think, oh, let them eat bread. Cool, the United Nations is really caring. They're giving us the right to food as if we've never had it. And they're making sure that we've got something to eat, bread in the wider meaning of the word. But when we start to break that down, we find that fiat is an order, a decree, a edict, legally binding command. So fiat is that it's a command from above. And as soon as you get an edict or a command, that means you're being ruled, you're being owned. So let's just put that into perspective. So we've got the right to eat because we are owned. I hope not. And then we look at panis, and that originally came out of Venice. And there's another wee hint to tyranny. I'll talk about that in a second. And that means it was an occupational name for a bread maker, or a baker. Came from the Italian word pane, P-A-N-E, for bread. And it also comes from the Latin to feed or nourish. So what we do know about the elites today is they claim they've got these ancient bloodlines. They keep their genes and genetics so close, and they intermarry. They might, have sow their wild oats, but when they get married, they marry into themselves, which is why AI is so important to them, because their genes are so depleted and so shallow now. They're looking less desirable, perhaps, than they want, considering they think they're the superior species, different than the rest of us plebs. But the Venice was the seat of the oligarchy, and the way United Nations runs today, that's the way it is. The few ruling the many. Also, the interesting thing is that the Venetians they birthed the Jesuits. The first Jesuit, Ignatius Loyola, he was a Phoenician. He had been to Padua University. He'd learned all about the Aristotelian ways of those that were born to rule, and the rest of us who were born to be ruled, that didn't really have a spirit and a soul. We were to be flicked like any insect that they might see. And also the other thing, to go back further in history, that the Venetians were actually the Phoenicians that were routed out of Carthage. Remember when Hannibal came in, and the Romans fought Carthage, and the elite fled, and they fled up into Padua, and then down into Venice, where they felt safer in the lagoons there. So we're still looking at the same oligarchy, the same tyranny that goes back millennia. And one thing we also know about the Phoenicians is they had a lot of word trickery. You remember, we know Phoenician, phonic, telephone, all those sorts of words come out from their trickery of words, which we'll go into another day. So that's just give you a little bit of the seat for this right to have food that we've been blessed with. So, but when we say that we have a right for food, that doesn't mean we have a right to grow food, or we have a right to be self-sufficient, or we have a right to look after oneself. Remember, this is an edict. This is a decree from above, from those that rule us. We just have a right for food. anecdotally, before Christmas, someone said to me, "Hey, you should watch Snowpiercer." I'd never heard of the movie before, but we decided to watch it over the holidays, my husband and our son. It was a little bit of a disturbing movie, but if you've got a moment to find it and watch it, you'll get a real feel about how this all runs today, and this chain of command, and the elite that are right up the front carriage of this train, and we useless eaters right at the back. And what were they eating? They were eating protein blocks, because remember, they have a right to food, and these protein blocks were made out of insects. And we know this is a big move even in New Zealand now, to bring insects into our diet. That's where we're going to get our protein from, because remember, with the Food and Agriculture Organization, and the United Nations also has the World Food Security. Again, that word security, quite different than perhaps the way we would see it. Once you bring all that into the Agenda 21, Agenda 2030, and the biodiversity assessment, and Mother Earth that mustn't be scratched, you're realizing that actually agriculture is going to be given the big flick. So we also know that once any socialist regime, which is what the United Nations is, which was what the Jesuits are, even Hitler said that his SS were to be modelled on the Jesuit, on Ignatius Loyola's Jesuit Society of Jesus. That's just, a nice name to make them sound all good. They had other names, but they thought it was too telling. But socialism is patterned on that. Hitler patterned his SS on that. And we know that the Russian gulags, how did they discipline the people that they didn't want? They deprived them of food. Mao Zedong starved millions of his own people to death. Even Stalin was just shocked that he would do that. Although, he had the gulags, but, Mao Zedong was even worse. Hitler and his concentration camps, Cambodia, even I was thinking about it earlier on, even when you go back into the early years of the North American continent, and the native Indians were just thrown into reservations there, not by the settlers, I might say. That's a whole different story again. It was actually the Jesuits behind that, into the reservation areas where they couldn't produce their own food. They couldn't make ends meet. And they were actually just starved and got a disease. And we know the horrible story going forward on that. So food is what socialist regimes use to discipline us. So my question is today, do we in New Zealand, do we really want to have an authority over us that is telling us what our rights are? We don't need to be told. And the minute we accept that we will accept those rights, we're owned. So I just want to think about it a little bit. Are they going to tell us next we have the right to breathe, as if we've never had that before? I know the CO2 tax coming on, and that is effectively a tax for the right to breathe. So, we're heading down that way. We need to pull back and just say, no, we don't want anyone telling us our rights. We know our rights. So once also an entity, United Nations, our New Zealand government, tells us that we have rights, what they're saying is, oh, you have privileges. Once we accept and come under that, we are now under a privilege. Once you have privileges, then it's reviewable, it's negotiable, and things start to change. So, and we know it does, because although United Nations came through in 1942 or 42, I think, we have Agenda 21 came out in 1992, and that changed so many things. Even before that, in the 1970s, things changed for the West, and we really started to go down with problems in jobs, employment, and also the standard of living and poverty and things like that. Things were pretty good. 70s, things started to take a dive because United Nations stepped in and our corrupt governments jumped on board with their decrees. So it's like the United Nations have come in and said, oh, you have the right to food, as if we've never had that right before. But what they've actually done is they've usurped our God-given rights, and we've accepted it. We've sort of said, oh, yeah, United Nations says we've got the rights. We've got all dazzled by what that might mean, and we've let go of our inalienable rights given under God, the law of God, the law of the land, the common law. So that's again, so if we're going to sit under the United Nations rights to food, what might that look like? Well, to put it into context, as I've said before, you need to look at the Agenda 21, Agenda 2030 documentations. You need to look at the biodiversity assessment, over 1,000-page document. And you also need to look at the philosophical or religious seat of the United Nations that says we mustn't scratch Mother Earth, Mother Gaia. She is all holy, and we mustn't scratch her. So we need to start eating insects and start closing down our agriculture. And we know in New Zealand already that our government have tried to shut down our domestic backyard gardens, and so we're prevented from finding our own food, producing our own food, and raising our own food. So these all our Agenda 21, Agenda 2030 things are all through that lens of equality, economic equality. This is global, remember, we're talking global. So, you know, if something's not going to fit the model in a poor village in Africa, we can't have that, because that's not economic equity. Same with environmental equity. If they can't farm and do whatever on the other side of the world, we can't do that either. And also social equity. So that's why the United Nations are telling us that we have the right to food, because they've got these equities sorted that needs to be filtered through the biodiversity, that we mustn't scratch the earth. So we're selling ourselves out to an impossible situation. Now, I also know they've got a depopulation agenda, so I guess we're not looking at all the numbers that we are seeing on the earth if they get their way. So therefore, we will be eating insects. We will be eating man-made food, laboratory-made food. And we know that Bill Gates of Hell has invested extremely heavily, billions, into a laboratory-made food, laboratory-made meat. He's boasted publicly that he's going to make crazy amounts of money by the time we get on there. We know that Bill and Melinda have private phone calls with Conrad Adern, organizing all sorts of setups and rules and regulations by which she's going to change legislation in this country, and we're going to lose our freedoms. The interesting thing is we had no problem feeding ourselves. We didn't have a food security until the elite started their wars and started their revolutions and started geoengineering and causing dreadful climatic changes in the area. Hastings and Napier had that dreadful flood just as they were planting. They are one of the pantry areas of our country. We've recently had horrendous rain that have wiped out tons and tons from the cherry industry. This, you can't tell me that this is just natural weather conditions. I know we're going into a maunder minimum. There will be a little bit of chaotic weather outcomes for us, but I think that this geoengineering is jumping on top of that, disguising in that, telling us that it's the climatic changes is our fault, and and causing more tyranny and destroying our food as a nation. We should be able to be a country moving forward that will be able to feed itself cheaply and also export well and develop a good standard of living for us. But of course, that's not social equity, is it? Because we live in a global community now, and we're not allowed to be well off in New Zealand and prosperous in New Zealand if other countries can't be. So it made me think, with this food security and the right to food, just like now we're hearing with COVID, oh, don't go and visit your mother, grandmother, don't leave your house, you'll kill your grandmother. This will be the next cry coming soon when it comes to food. They're going to be saying, don't have more than 2 children or you're going to kill a child over in Africa. This is all part of the social equity. They'll start bringing out this rhetoric, these little pithy sayings that everyone will agree in because they'll see the world as having a food crisis. So just finishing, Jacinda Ardern's speech to the UN. She was bragging about the national voluntary review she did in 2019 for the UN, telling them where we are up to achieving Agenda 2030 on time. And she says, I'm proud to present New Zealand's first voluntary national review on progress towards sustainable development goals. The report is a demonstration, I hope, of that's the government, not us, our strong commitment to 2030 agenda for sustainable development. So this food security is and the right to food is going to look a whole lot different than what we think it is very soon. She goes on a little bit later on in the speech. She says, as we transition, so we're transitioning to sustainable, productive, inclusive economy, that's the government, do require a deeper understanding of the groups who will be most affected. So that might be you and me with our back garden vegetable patch, or our chickens that are where we're getting our eggs from. We're going to be most affected because we're not going to be allowed to do that. So we, the government, can ensure the right strategies are in place to support them. And I talked yesterday with the COVID vaccine, having the plan for those that aren't keen. And here we go again, the right strategies. So whether it's going to be the army with their guns, their rifles, or what, I do not know, but they're going to get strategies in place for the most effective. Then Ardern at the Bill and Melinda Goalkeepers Conference speech in 2019, she said this: when it comes to a set of rules for a country to live by, rules, now we've got rules. You would struggle to do better than the Sustainable Development Goals. Wow, there it is. So get ready for austerity, people, because we're not going to be living a very high life style of living at all. And she says, any serious politician would be hard-pressed to argue with the goals like halving poverty or providing decent work. Well, she's been in government for well long enough to have that swung around very quickly. This is New Zealand. We're not a deprived country. We only have these things that have got worse under her governance because she wants it to get really bad. She wants to have these problems. So halving poverty was doubled in her time, providing decent work or quality education, and clean water and peace and justice for all. So we know that she's talking elitist language. She's talking Agenda 2030 language. She's not talking common language about people that can work in their communities and have a strong, healthy community. So the New Zealand Conservation Authority printed this in 2017. Where there is insufficient information or effects may be irreversible, the precautionary principle should apply. So that's what they're doing here in New Zealand. That is a United Nations Agenda 2030 biodiversity assessment precautionary language. So if there's any doubt that there's going to be any problem we will not be allowing things to happen. And that's why the way we raise our food now will not be the way of the future. If we don't stand up now and say, United Nations, we don't want your silly rights. On your way, we're sorted. Kennedy Warren, he was the co-founder of New Zealand Geographic magazine, and he writes for New Zealand Geographic and the National Geographic magazines. And the National Geographic, that is owned by the elite. That's particularly owned with several partners, but particularly the Walt Disney organization that have gobbled up a lot of the media companies and just swallowed them. This is a big corp that's pulling the strings, totally sold in with the United Nations. Anyway, in an article, Troubled Waters by Warren, he was talking to a McDowell. Now, I didn't get a chance. He may be a dock worker. I didn't get a chance as I pulled this together this morning to find out exactly who he is. But here's an idea of how in New Zealand they're thinking about the precautionary principle. Instead of saying this land is suitable for dairy or beef, we should be saying this land is suitable for reasonably high nitrogen loss, but needs to have very low phosphorus and sediment loss. What? When we look for those new ideas on how best to match agriculture options to these load factors. Goes on. In the future, you could see a mosaic of land uses in which farmers meet their economic environmental objectives, equity and biodiversity objectives, don't scratch Mother Earth, while the catchment and people outside the catchment also have their objectives met, social, cultural, recreation, and so on. A lot of gibbly-gook. Such a change in thinking might take a generation, said McDowell. The meaning of the words farm and farmer in the future could be very different from the meaning today. Yep, because United Nations that are governing us, that are telling us what our rights are decreeing how we can produce our food. We've got the right to food, but we haven't got the right to choose how that food will be produced, grown, raised, and I would say coming down the pipe, we're going to have more processed food in our supermarkets, which we know will produce cancers, Alzheimer's, bowel cancers, and all sorts of other cancers to boot because of the hormones. And if you're making synthetic meat, you need to have antibiotics. This is going to be a toxic food that we're going to be given. I've already said to you before with Codex Alimentarius, their mineral amounts of minerals and vitamins in food have reduced right down because they've now classified that as a toxin. So they've got to, for food security and for our protection, decide how many minerals and vitamins we're going to get. This is a desperate time, and we need to stand up now and say, I do not consent to the United Nations rights. I do not consent to their arm in this country. So there we go. A little bit of cheery news again, but we need to be informed. We need to know this. And when people ask us why perhaps Agenda 21, Agenda 2030 is a problem to us, we need to be able to explain to them that it's not just the documentation and no more poverty, no more hunger, etc., etc. It's the documents that sits on that's got the teeth. You know, it's the devil in the detail. That's where the devil is. The biodiversity assessment and the 101 other documents, and particularly that our government are producing and have produced for some years now. It gives you a headache. It's just the documents just come thick and fast. No wonder we can't get to the bottom of it. No wonder we're completely bamboozled. But the bottom line is we do not consent, actually. We do not consent. So on that note, thank you again for joining me this morning, and have a great day. It's a bit cold down here in the South Waikato. But I've got a little bit of work to do outside, so I'll put on my gardening gloves and I'll get out there. So thank you very much, and I'll see you tomorrow morning. Bless you now.